Cool. Well, welcome everybody. I'm very thankful and grateful that all of you are here. Today, we're basically continuing from the last time. So the first session, I kind of went through the web application that we're going to go through deploying to Azure. And just to recap very quickly, in case some of you are not there, I have no idea. So the idea is just taking somewhat of a typical web application that you might kind of see in your work or things like that, where there's a front-end app that is in React, which happened to be a Hacktoberfest project that was done October of last year by the front-end track. Taking that's talking to an API which is written with .NET, and that API is surfacing some data using a SQL Server database, basically. And actually, put a link to the repo. Sorry. Yeah, going between the chat and this will take a little, but that's okay. We will figure it out. Okay, so basically, this is where the code is if you want to take a look at it yourself later or familiarize yourself with it. And there's some instructions here on how to run it locally. So the last time I basically ran through pretty much the instructions that are in this README of how to set it up and locally and just get it running so you can kind of see it for yourself, right? And because typically, if you're working on anything, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to try to get it running locally, code it locally and everything, right? Now, once you have it working locally, you want to get it out there in the world for everybody else to see, right, as a web application. So today, we're going to go through how can we deploy this using Azure as a cloud provider in this case. So there are a few services in Azure. Actually, there are different ways in Azure, obviously. As everything in tech, there's always many different ways to do things, right? So even in Azure itself, there are actually different ways that we can deploy like a web application like this. I'm choosing this one right now using something called Azure App Service for the two web, as in the front end and the backend APIs. And then there's Azure SQL available as what's called a managed service in Azure. And a managed service basically means you're not really responsible for the underlying infrastructure of the SQL Server. So SQL Server ultimately has to live on some sort of a machine, like a virtual machine or something. So you're not going to be responsible for that portion. You're basically like just using the database there. So you will create the database there and you will create the tables in the database and the schema and put data and all that. But you won't be responsible for, keeping it up to date, things like this. So the actual managing the infrastructure is done by the cloud provider, in this case, Azure. So that's what's meant by a managed service. And the concept there is, I guess, just to say very quickly, there's a concept called infrastructure as a service, platform as a service that you will hear in cloud. And basically, the acronym is IaaS and PaaS over there. But basically what it means is from a cloud provider, you can actually choose to, I guess, essentially rent the infrastructure. So virtual machines, setting up your own networks, basically the data center that typically you would have had on your own hardware, you can now do it on the cloud provider's hardware. That's infrastructure service, usually the most expensive, but it's for a lot of companies, it may be too much of work to completely change their whatever legacy applications they've had for years. It may be too much to change that completely to use more of managed services and things. So they may choose to go with this first to get into cloud and then slowly start changing, rewriting, refactoring, redesigning to use more what's called cloud native. So cloud native essentially means you're getting kind of closer to using the managed services of cloud. So that's where you get platform as a service. Serverless also is a very popular concept for this, where you're really not managing infrastructure anymore. You're just saying, here's my code, go, deploy it for me. Go host it for me, essentially, right? That's the kind of idea. So what we're going to be using today is what's called the PaaS, or platform as a service, essentially with these that we're going to be using. So Azure App Service for the React frontend app and the backend API, and then Azure SQL for the database. All right, so let's get started here. So I'm using my Azure account. So you can sign up for an Azure account for free. You do have to give a credit card, but they give you $200 credit when you sign up for the first time for the first 30 days. And there are certain services that are free. There's something called a free tier. So it actually shows up here, like these are all the things that you can essentially use, but there are limits essentially on these different things. And these top ones here are the ones that are free for, I think, 12 months, the first year. And then there are some that are always free, like Azure Functions, which is serverless, and the app service that I'm going to be using today, and certain other things. So to get started, so the first thing with Azure is everything. So the subscription is what you get when you create the account. And the subscription is basically how you're managing the cost for everything that you create with your Azure account. And in this case, yeah, I spent a little bit of my $200 credit, it's telling me, but this is where you can come in, you can set up budgets. I think I put like $1 or something. Yeah, over here says like $1 a month. You can set up cost alerts to tell you, hey, you're reaching your budget. You can do cost analysis to see, where costs, how much, different resources are costing you and things like that. So that's a subscription. In order to start creating anything in Azure, everything goes inside what's called a resource group. And a resource group it's basically just a way of grouping the resources, nothing more than that. So it's just a container for everything that you're going to create in Azure. So we're going to go with workshop resources. And I'm going to choose everything in East-US because that's just where I'm based. So I'm going to go with that. And then once we have that, in here is where we would end up creating the three. So 2 Azure App Services and 1 database, according to this, right? So I'm going to go backwards because as you can see, when I bring up the front end, it's going to call the API. Well, one of the pages in it is going to call the API, and an API is going to connect to the database to get the data and then surface back. So I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to do Azure SQL first, and then I'll do the 2 app services, and we'll walk through that. And anytime, feel free to unmute and ask questions, but I have the chat window here, so I'm looking at that as well. All right, so first we'll do the database. So I was in the resource group, and now these are just the proper ones. So SQL database is the one I'm going to do here. And it automatically chooses my resource group for me since I click create from in there. For convenience, go with Tens, cloud, DB. So this is the database, and then a database lives in a database server. So that's what this is. And I need to create new since I'm doing it for the first time. I like to prefix everything the same. And then I will choose SQL authentication. So cloud shop user password here. Okay, I see a question here. Does Azure offer a NoSQL database option? Yes. Why choose SQL here over NoSQL? Yeah, that's a very good question. There is a NoSQL option. There is something called Cosmos DB in Azure. That is their NoSQL managed service that they offer. You can also use MongoDB with it. I believe it has a MongoDB provider with it. So you have those as options. The only reason, to be very honest with you, why I chose SQL here is only because of my experience of getting this application set up. This is just a little, it's like a very, very simple thing that I just brought up quickly. So to be very honest, that's the only reason. With what you'll see in a minute what data we're surfacing, it can completely be done with a NoSQL database. So I might actually choose to do that in a later session, actually. So a good question. Let's see, want to use SQL Elastic Pool, and I'm going to do that. So I'm going to configure the database, and I'm going to choose like the tiniest thing that I can. So because there is like a very minimal cost is what I've seen. So I'm going to choose that. Now for the networking, I'm going to go with public endpoint because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be deploying things from my machine to Azure. So I have the code for the application as well as for the database. There are certain like schema, like tables and things that had to be created. And I'm going to be connecting from my machine to do that. So that's why I'm going to choose a public endpoint. Typically, I would say what you would do, like in a production sort of scenario, there's a way to create like your own network. It's called a virtual network in Azure. And typically you create a virtual network and have everything inside that, so that because your database, there's no reason for a database to be publicly available. That's why you usually put APIs on top, right? So that the API is the public interface, if you will. The database would be private, right? But in this case, I'm going to do public because I'm going to be connecting from my machine. So, and for this one, allow Azure services and resource to access the server. This is also, again, typically you would say no, and you would try to keep things within a network. But for right now, just to keep this a little simpler, I'm going to say yes, in the sense that I want my Azure App Service that I'm going to make next to be able to connect to this database. And if I do yes, then it actually lets basically any Azure resource will be able to connect to this database, any Azure resource that I make, right? So I'm going to go with a little, I guess, not so typical ways of doing it is the way I'd put it here, to kind of keep the whole configuration simpler, because the more you lock things down, then the more things you have to configure, so just to sort of keep this limited in scope, this is why I'm doing it. So for this one, add current client IP address, I'm going to leave this out. And this is actually something that I will be doing later. And I want to show you why that part would be needed. So I'm going to leave that as a no. And this part is basically talking about how you communicate with the SQL database server. And I'm just going to leave the default settings for that. I don't need to do any of these. These are all like advanced settings, and I don't need to use any of these. I am going to have my own way of making the data get into the database, so I don't need to use any of this. I don't need to put any tags, so I'm going to go ahead and create that. So while that is happening, so it's going to take probably a couple minutes. It's actually not very slow. I mean, it's actually pretty quick. So while that's going on, I can go ahead and now make the app services. So back in the Cloud Workshop resources, I'm going to go create, and I'm going to create the web app. Okay, I am going to get to your question then, well, in a minute, if you don't mind. Let me get through this. So this one now, I'm going to do this second one here, which is the .NET application. So we'll call it API, Azure says .NET. I'm going to go with code because what I'm going to show you is I'm going to be publishing this from Visual Studio directly, but you do have Docker container as an option as well if you want to package your application into a Docker image and have it hosted. You can also do that here. Azure provides what's called a container registry. So you can, you don't have to use a public one like Docker Hub. You can use a private container registry, your own private container registry in Azure, and you can basically have this app service pull images from there if you want to do it that way as well. So it supports both ways of doing it. And static web app is actually another way to deploy, especially this kind of application where there's a React front-end app and APIs, which is actually something I'm probably going to go through in the next session, actually, when I talk kind of about serverless and how to do that. So we're going to leave that alone. So for right now, we're going to go with the code option. And I'm going to go with .NET 6 on this one. I'm going to go with Linux on this one. Go with EastUS as I'm doing. And the app service plan is basically, so because this is a managed service, you don't have direct access to the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure. What this is it's like an abstraction on top of whatever virtual machines or whatever Azure is doing to host your web application. Oh, the database got done. Whatever it's doing for the web application, it basically, the app service plan is like the abstraction on top of that. So you can choose to scale up your application if you want, like if you're under a heavy load, and there are certain like costs and things. There are sort of different ways you want to host your web application is controlled by the app service plan in this case. So I'm gonna choose the free one here, just the F1 there. And okay, so the continuous deployment portion is where Azure has some integration with GitHub Actions to do deployment rather than me doing it from my local machine. But it's not something anyway that's available. We're going to leave that disabled. This is the monitoring that you can enable application insights. It's the monitoring tool basically available in Azure to be able to monitor your application with like logs and traces and getting metrics and things like that. For right now, we're gonna not do that and go ahead and create that. Okay, while that's happening, let me see a question real quick, Noel. Simply if it's how the various cloud providers measure up, meaning Azure versus AWS versus GCP. I'm seeing that they're all starting to offer very similar but slightly different services. If we're doing a personal project for a portfolio, or if we want to learn one that employers most want to see, do you have a recommendation there? Very good question. To me, what you're saying is correct. Like that's what I feel as well. Like they are very similar to each other. So you can't go wrong with going with either of them, I think is the way I'd put it. But what I would suggest is, especially if you're starting with cloud, pick one and just go with it, right? So whichever one, I guess. I think AWS seems to have the most, because it kind of was the first, essentially. It has the most resources out there that you can find, documentation and community, right? And things like that. Azure definitely has come up a lot. And GCP is also strong, like coming up strong, I would say, right? So not so much of a problem anymore. You can really pick any one of them, but I would definitely suggest to pick one and just go with that first and like get fully familiar, because once you get familiar with one cloud provider, getting familiar with another one will be much quicker also, because as you say, they are very similar, and they truly are very similar, because there are a lot of patterns just with software development, with technology in general, that you're going to, that's why the services that are provided are going to be similar, because at the end of the day, you're kind of doing similar things. So how companies decide and what they do and all that, it's all about how they negotiate with each cloud provider at the end of the day, right? As far as like actual companies doing it. But for your own personal things, personal projects, I would just suggest pick one and go with it. And you really can't go wrong with any of them, I don't think. And they all provide you like a free account, free tier services, and all this stuff, right? So I don't think you can go wrong with anything. And yeah, I do agree that serverless is a fast and easy way for side projects. I do agree, because you pretty much just saying, here's the code, go deploy it for me, and boom, you just have it. With this, it's a little bit, even with the PaaS services, you have to at least go through this. There's some minor, I guess, infrastructure involved in actually creating these things and sort of configuring them together, as I'm going to be showing you right now. I would agree that serverless it's like a higher level of abstraction in the layers, if you will, essentially. All right, so the API one is finished. So now that the database server is done, I'm gonna go back to the database server. So we'll go in our resource group, and we should see, so we see 4 things here. Oh, it looks like I misspelled that. It's okay. So the app service plan is what contains the app service, which right now is just the one for the API. And then we have a database server with the one Azure SQL database that I made. So what I will need from that is a connection string. So this connection string is the way, again, I'm doing like the easiest way. There are other ways to do it without like exposing, taking this and putting it in other places. There are more secure ways to do this, but I'm going with the simpler way right now. So one thing I need to do, this is a completely empty database that has pretty much nothing inside it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to put my data, the schema, like my tables and stuff, and the data in them. There's a tool with .NET, because I'm using .NET, there's a tool called, well, there's a library that I'm using called Entity Framework that is basically a way for an object-oriented language like C# to be able to communicate with a relational database like SQL Server, and then be able to just do the queries for me and then transform the data into objects kind of thing easily, right? And it also provides me tools to create what's called migrations to be able to create the schema and see data in it and stuff. So I have all this. So these migrations basically represent, that's the schema that's like create table with the columns and all this stuff. And then see data is now insert all the data in kind of thing. So there's a tool that you can install, which this is the kind of stuff I went through in the first session. With that, you'll be able to put everything into the database. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take that connection string and I'm gonna see my super secret password here. Ignore that. All right, so now that I have this, I will be able to, so now I'm in the API folder, which is in here. Run that tool here. And one thing you're gonna see, so what this is supposed to do is it's supposed to connect to the database server and it's supposed to create the tables and the data. But as you see, it gave me an error because what it's saying is it can't connect to that database server. This is my public IP here. And the reason is because before I did not, I have to basically make a firewall rule to the database server to allow my IP address to be able to connect to it, which is what I left as no before. So in the database server, in the firewalls and virtual networks here, I can add, and Azure is basically showing me the IP address that I can use. And then save that. So once I do this, I'm basically saying allow this IP address to come in and connect to the database server. So now if I run this, should be able to make it. And now it's creating the data, the tables, all the stuff. So now in order to make sure that it did it, we can take a look. So there is an extension Visual Studio Code that you can use to connect to the database. But I'm just going to show you in the Azure portal itself, it does give you this query editor that we can also use just to temporarily, or quickly, I should say, see that everything got made. So in tables, these are the 3 tables that I have. And under resources, that's the data that got put in, right? So this data is what you're going to end up seeing on the front end app eventually when we're done, right? So the database is ready. So now I want to, I don't want to save any of that. So for the API at this point is empty. I haven't deployed my code yet. I do want to put in the setting in here to be able to connect to the database server. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first, and then I'm going to deploy the code. So autocomplete helping me out here. That's not what I want. So I need that connection string. So this is the way I can get my API to be able to connect to that database. And this is an Azure SQL. So SQL Azure there, save that, continue. Got to make sure to click all the buttons to save everything. That has tripped me up in the past. Okay. So now that's saved, and now I'm ready to deploy the .NET app here. And as I said, today I'm going to use Visual Studio. I'm hoping in later sessions I'll be able to show you how to do it using a continuous integration tool. So typically when you're working in a team, like right now, this is just me working on the project. So I can just, get it from my machine into Azure, no problem. But when you're working in a team of like 10, 20, 30,000 developers, whatever the case may be, then you want something more centralized to manage getting the code in, making sure things are good, running tests, all that good stuff. So generally use something like GitHub Actions is one that's there. Azure DevOps one I've used in the past. There's so many. Circle CI. There are many, many what's called continuous integration, continuous deployment tools. So at some point later, hopefully I should be able to show that. But for today, we're going to use my machine. So in order to publish the code with .NET, do a .NET publish that creates a publish folder. Sorry. Or should create a publish folder? Oh. Not that. Okay, let's do that. Okay, yeah, so this is the publish folder with all my DLLs and everything, which you typically get with the .NET application. So what I'm using is a extension in Visual Studio Code called Azure App Service. This from Microsoft. So this allows me to connect to my Azure account, and actually let me do that here. Yeah. So since I deployed that API, this extension, I already signed into my Azure account here. So that's why it's showing me whichever app services I make. So when I make the second one, it's going to show up here too. So over here is showing me the API. So now I will be able to use that extension to deploy this to the API. And yes, I want to deploy to it. So now what it does is it's called a zip deploy, and essentially it zips up the folder that I just picked and sends it off to Azure, to that application service. It is what it's going to do. And once it does that, then we'll be able to navigate to, there's just one endpoint in this API, it's super simple. And it turns JSON off the data that you saw in the database table, that applications table. We'll be able to see that. So while that's going on, I'm going to go ahead and make the other application service for the front-end app. So I'm going to create another one. And choose my resource. We'll just go with Test Cloud Workshop. So I'm going to do code for this one. And since this is a React app, we're going to serve it on a node server, essentially. It's just there. I want to use the same. So I can use the same app service plan that I used before. In fact, the free account, I think, only lets you do one anyway. Excuse me. And we do that, enable application insights. No, I'm not going to do that. And we'll just create. And another thing also, all these screens that I'm showing you through the portal where everything is being done through the UI, there is a concept called infrastructure as code, where you can actually use tools like, so Azure gives you something called ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager templates, or Bicep, I think now is ARM and then Bicep. So Bicep, I think, is a new tool that's come out from Azure, which I've not seen yet, but that basically lets you sort of code out this these resources, I guess I would call it, these services that we're making in Azure, rather than you clicking through the UI. Because what's nice about that is you get pretty much all the good things you get with just code in general. You get version control, you can do even like CI pipelines with it and make sure that it's somewhat like similar to code, right? Things are centralized, you can have a team working on things and stuff like that. So maybe that also might be a future session, let's see. Sorry, I just saw a question. Can you talk a bit more about the publish folder? Seems like it was auto-generated. Yep, it's really how with the .NET application that you can get the code ready to publish to wherever it is that you need to host the .NET application. So with .NET, and this is the latest .NET as opposed to .NET Framework, you get .NET as like a CLI to use. So the .NET publish, when I said -O here, that means output folder. So it basically put it in an output folder called, I just happen to call it publish. So that's why by running this command here, it basically compiled the .NET application that I have. And everything that's needed to host a .NET application is in that publish folder. So the app things, JSON, the DLLs that like I'm referencing, a lot of Microsoft stuff I'm referencing, plus my own code that I made is also a DLL in here. So this folder has all my code, the dependencies, everything as like one package essentially. So that's the idea of the publish. I hope that made sense. Definitely ask if there's something that doesn't make sense. So going to output, this is finished. So in order to now see that things are working, so this is 404 because the first, like it is a actual different URL, and it takes a little bit of time for the very first time to spin up. From what I've seen, using the free T, okay, this actually came up pretty quickly. So this is basically the JSON. So it's a little hard to see, but this is some of the data that actually was in the table before, the database table that I showed you. So the API is connected to the database and getting the data correctly, so we're good there. Let's see. So Test Cloud Workshop got made, which is now going to house my front-end application. So this one. Now, for the Node application, I'm sorry, not Node, the React application, I did have to, because I'm going to be deploying it again from my machine here, the way that it's going to connect to the API is by having a .env, well, .env.production, because I'm going to build the React application in production mode. And this React App Resource API URL was talking to the URL for the app service that I just made. That's why I named it specifically this, because I have this in my configuration for the front-end app to be able to talk to the API, right? So for this UI, in order to build that, so this is a React app, which you do, so I'm in the UI folder, which is this folder for the React app, npm run build. What this does is, React app will always have a package JSON, and the package JSON has a script section that lets you run. NPM is basically Node's package manager, so it lets you run certain scripts from this package JSON. So it looks in here, and because I have a script called build, when I said npm run build, it's running this as the command. And React scripts, there's something called create React app that's generally used to essentially create a React app, as it says. So this is what was used to make this, and it generates this for us in there. So it has the way to build the React app, basically compiled on all the React component, everything into plain JavaScript, and it makes interesting for some reason. Oh yeah, there it is, build. So it's called build over here, and under static you have JS and all those minified, all this stuff. So this build folder that it made is what we will need to deploy to the app service for the front end app. And what it does is, because it builds in production mode, it takes the env production instead of, so this env file will only be used for local development, and that's why it says localhost 7071, which actually is what this API would be running as locally if you ran it on your machine. But the env production is what will get used, and that gets built into the JavaScript essentially. So with this approach, the any configuration that you have like this, like if you had other APIs or the front-end app need to talk to, it does get built into the JavaScript application. So now when I deploy this build folder, oh, I need to refresh because I created that. Every time I'll need to come in here to refresh this if I create new things in Azure. So do that again. Deploy, and Test Cloud Workshop is the front end. We'll deploy that. So again, it's doing the same thing. It's taking that build folder, zipping it, and sending it to the app service. Now, one thing I do need to do here, so this is the Test Cloud Workshop, which is meant for the front end app. Because it's a React app, there is, and we use Node as the code, we chose that as a platform, right? The code platform we use to host it. We do have to use something called PM2. PM2 is basically a process manager for Node.js applications. And this is something that's actually built into the Azure App Service to use. And we can use this to serve the files that we're putting in. So a React app essentially becomes HTML and JavaScript and CSS and that kind of thing. So in order to serve it up, the underlying infrastructure needs to be like a file server, essentially. So that's why we need to, what will happen is the app service, when it starts up, essentially, it will run this command. And that way it will be available whenever you request a front-end app from the browser, like we're going to do when we hit the URL. It's basically going to serve from this home site root. This is a folder like inside the Azure App Service, where when I clicked on that deploy web app over here, or any way you deploy, actually, it doesn't matter which way you deploy, internally in the Azure App Service, it copies this build folder into that home site root folder inside the Azure App Service. So what we're saying with this is, and the SPA basically says, because with React app, it has like a built-in client-side routing that it does. I'm going to show that in a second. We have to give this as an option so that every request that comes here will always go to what's called index.html, which is like the main HTML for the application that you should always be hitting. And then once you go there, React kind of takes over and does routing if you go to different URLs in your app. It's somewhat of a front-end concept, I guess I would say, with React or Angular or any of those frameworks. And the node Daemon here just basically says to run in the foreground within the Azure App Service, right? So this is a command within Azure App Service that is going to run so that this Azure App Service can work can basically serve those HTML, CSS, JavaScript files and stuff. And I forgot to save. Like I said, it trips me up, but at least it warned me this time. So clicking too soon. Okay, there we go. So now this is ready, and let's check here. Yeah, so it says it's done, and it gives you a way to actually browse from here, or I can click back here if I wanted to. Let's see if I click from here. Give me that. It's not done yet. So since I did the deploy in this, I think I will need to restart it because I did that configuration change. That. I'm gonna go from here. Okay, there we go. So this is the front-end app that was made by the front-end track, as I mentioned. Now this is static content here. Most of this is static content. I just took one piece from here and made it talk to this API endpoint, the API resources here. So that's actually this resources page over here. When I go in, and I'm gonna open the dev tools actually to show you. What this is supposed to show is tiles that show that data. And now, yeah, so as you see, there is an error here called course, right? So what this is saying is if you notice, because I made two different app services, they have two different URLs at the main URL. So one says Test Cloud Workshop API.azurewebsites.net. Another one says Test Cloud Workshop.azurewebsites.net, right? They're two different APIs. So generally, the browser will see this, it will prevent this from happening because you're trying to request from your Test Cloud Workshop, you're trying to access something from a different URL. And it's CORS because it's cross-origin request sharing, I think is what it stands for. So you're trying to go across a different domain, essentially. So what you have to do is you have to allow on the server, meaning the API level, you have to allow, you can allow CORS to say, allow requests from this domain of Test Cloud Workshop and serve the data. I'm allowing you to do that, essentially, right? And that is something we can configure on the app service level. So I'm going to do that on the API. Oh, not there. So there is a CORS section here. And should I type it? Let's see. Workshop.azurewebsites.net. I also need to check that, I believe, save. All right. And now I'm going to go back to the main for a second. Just put this down a little bit. And go to network tab. Oops, sorry, bring it up a little bit. Clear that. And now when I click on resources, oh, too soon. So we start. So that's it, doesn't it? All right. Maybe even so. So as you can see, when it comes to configuring things all together, you can run into stuff like this. And apparently I did not save it. Okay. So I'm doing that now. No, that looks correct. Okay. I'm on the API. Let's see, let's make sure the API endpoint is still up and running. Yeah, after I restart, it does take a little while to come up, I noticed. So that does work. I'm gonna go back here. And there we go. So it looks like it took a little while. I've seen it do it faster before, so that's interesting. But yeah, so now this is hitting that API resources, which is this that was returning that JSON, right? And that JSON is basically used to make the tiles like this, so that you can also, let's see, switch, yeah, to a table. And you get to see, so this information is coming out of the database to the API to here, essentially. And yeah, so there we go. I actually got it to work. So yeah, I just wanted to show some of the things. When you have to configure multiple things together, it's important to understand like how things are communicating with each other. To the IP address here, CORS here, things like this. Now, technically, you can have the React app and the .NET app, since they're both Azure App Service, you can have them in the same one. And then you're using the same URL to get to both. But you would have to do some extra configuration to make sure that, like, when I go to /API, it should go to my .NET app. When I go to basically anything else, because this goes to /resources here, but that's a React app, like /resources. So you have to do some configuration to let it know kind of which way to go when you're going to the URL. So keep it a little simpler. Plus, I could show the CORS thing as something to consider with that. That's why I chose to go with two different ones, basically. Yeah, and that's pretty much what I have for this one at this point. So this is one way that you can deploy the web app with the in Azure. Any other questions or anything? I don't think I saw anything new pop up. And in the next session, what I want to try to do is show, so it's serverless, Azure provides Azure functions. So the .NET application that I have as the API, I will have to add something in the code to make it, basically make it an Azure function, because there's a bit of framework you have to use from Azure to do it. So I will have to change this API a little bit to allow it to convert it, I would say, into an Azure function to use it that way. And I think that's a more popular, more typical way of doing, especially for something as simple as what I'm doing here. This app service is a little heavier for sure, but it's still a good demo. So good way to demo. But yeah, I am not seeing anything else in the chat.
Sunitha, may I ask a question that I'm not sure I can articulate in the chat?
Absolutely, please.
One place where my brain sometimes gets tripped up is sort of following the path of the data, right? So, I mean, as simple as it started, as seed data in VS Code, and then it went, I think if we were tracing it from the back to the front is kind of what I'm getting at, right? It goes to the database, and then it goes to the API, and then, yeah, I mean, would you be willing to sort of talk through that, or even talk through the path of a request, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. So basically, so if you follow this part here is the very first Test Cloud Workshop Azure Websites.net portion, right? So when this, and it's really just this one page, the resources page, the other two are just static text that's built into the React app itself. So when I go to those resources, it makes this call here to the API one, right? Which is the second Azure App Service. And it calls this API resources endpoint, right? And it is in C#, I apologize, but hopefully it won't be too difficult to understand. But basically what it's doing is it's hitting this resources controller, and it's hitting this get resources when you call this API/resources, right? So because this is an API controller, this is how it works with at least the ASP.NET. This is the ASP.NET way, I guess we put it that way. So it hits this API controller/resources. And what this portion is doing is it's going to the database, that SQL Server database, and it's saying, get me data from the resources and also join to these other two tables. So let me show you the SQL Server portion quickly. Should have actually kept this open probably. Nope, I did it wrong. Oh, okay, good. And obviously now it's going to try to get slow on me. But basically, the three tables that are referenced in this code here, resources, application, periods, and locations, these are tables within the SQL Server database. And this is just doing essentially it's just doing select all and resources, join to application, periods, and locations, because there's a relation there essentially, and just get all that, convert all of that into JSON and return it, right? But the framework is taking care of it. I don't need to say it that way. I can write it like this, if that makes sense. So it's doing a select on all those tables. Yeah. So this table here is resources. I'm just going to do a select from it real quick to show you data. Man, okay. I don't know why it suddenly got slower. So as you can see here, this is Google Summer Code, Free Software Foundation, etc. There's body, there's URL, eligibility criteria. If you look here on the front end, and I click this more info, you basically see the same thing that surfaced from that database. Does that, I guess, first of all, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking. Yep.
Does that make sense now how they're like connected to? I hope it does at least.
Yes, the one visually for me, I didn't see it, but the one step between this database and the front end is the API.
It is the API. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Because the front end portion is running on your browser, right? So it needs to be able to connect to something to get that data. And typically you don't have the database exposed. You try to put APIs on top of your database, it has permissions. Maybe you'd have things like login and stuff like that coming. I mean, of course, all that is not into play here. This is a very simple site, but typically, if you think about it, the reason you have the API layer on top of the database is to, you can now massage the data according to what the front end wants, right? Like if the front end didn't need all of this, all it needed was just URLs to this stuff, for example, then you could just surface that data if you wanted, right? So there's, and again, the way you design the API, it's different from the way you store the data in the database. Those are like different things. Different things to consider there. So yes, it's front end calls an API endpoint, and the API is what then talks to the database to get data and send it in a format for the front end to then use.
And let's say you wanted to add a filter or a search or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you try to do that through React, kind of more as a front end change, or would that be maybe a different call to your database?
Very good question. As always, it depends, right?
Right.
So it really depends on the data, right? So you can definitely do it within React, but you have to think about how much data you're dealing with. Are you dealing with 10, 100, a million? Those are the kinds of things. And then what kind of search, what kind of filtering? You can take different ways around that. There are many different ways to approach that. To start with, you could start with on the React side and just do everything client side. But that may not work very well if you're trying to get a million, because you can't get a million upfront because you're going to have to wait for probably a long time for that to come through, right? So you may need to have some paging involved. Now, if you have paging involved, then maybe you do need to do it server side. So it kind of depends on the data, what kind of search you're doing. You know, if you're trying to do like a free text search, like a Google search style, then maybe you won't even use SQL, you'd use something else to do that. And then that would be a different API that you use for that. So there's sort of different ways you can go about doing that, depending on the data that you're dealing with. In this specific case, since I only have like 12 in here, yeah, I could just do it in React and call it a day, no problem. I don't necessarily need to do it on the API side. But if it's going to be something that's going to potentially grow over time, then it might actually be better to do it on the server and let the because the server is something that can handle more load. It's a bigger thing. Like typically that is more, that can handle a much bigger load than your browser on your machine can, right? And plus you have to think about how much data are you also getting back, because you want to not get too much data upfront as well. Like there's a threshold there, essentially. So that's how you kind of decide, is it okay to just be on React side, or do you need it to be, sometimes it's a little bit of both, depending on the experience you want to have for your user. So it is quite specific to the use case that you have. Really good questions. I appreciate it. It's really cool. Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to, now we're almost close to the hour too, so pretty good time. Nice. And feel free to DM me if you're in, I know Noel, you're in our Slack, so you can feel free to message me if you want. I'm more than happy to answer whatever questions that you have, if you like, no problem. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn. You can find me Sunitha Patel on LinkedIn. So I'm more than happy to answer more questions after. No problem there. If I know the answer, of course. Otherwise, I'll find out. We'll learn. So, all right. I am not seeing any more questions, and I know it's pretty early and pretty late for some of you. So if that's it, then I guess I'm going to let y'all go. And thank you all so much for coming. I really do appreciate it. And I hope this was helpful and understandable. Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody.